Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Grabois, and I am the horn professor at UW-Madison. I play horn in the Wisconsin Brass Quintet, and I am talking with Tom Curry, our tuba professor, and with Jean Laurenz, our trumpet professor. The date is April 14th. In any normal situation, we would frantically be finishing up our tax preparation, but this is not any normal situation. We are coming to around the 1 month mark of our confinement at home. We're under a stay-at-home order. The university is shut down except for teleconferencing classes, and therefore the Wisconsin Brass Quintet is not able to rehearse or really do much of anything together. We haven't been within 6 feet of each other and probably haven't been within a couple of miles of each other in a month. Nonetheless, we're all keeping busy and we want to talk about many things related to what we're up to and what it's like to play in a brass quintet, what it's like to be a professor, and we plan on having a wide-ranging conversation on many, many topics. But first, I would just like to find out from Jean. Jean, what are you up to?
That's a good question. Well, I guess I feel as busy as ever in a fun way, in a way that's a little bit more autonomous. Some of those projects are my own. Sort of exploring, I've been practicing a lot and exploring my instrument in the way that I want to approach it, and with no looming deadlines, it's been extremely refreshing. And I can't remember any time in my adult life when that's happened, except for a couple summers. And then I've just been sort of meeting with my students and trying to plan as many projects as we can and trying to create as much of a digital fingerprint as we can in this time and trying to use the music that we make to kind of help others if we can. So just kind of like randomly filling up projects and kind of finding passion projects that have had a lid on them for a while and using my time that way. I'm also looking into adopting a dog. It's a tedious project, but it's a big part of my life.
And I'd like to talk more about the dog, but maybe what I would ask you is, it's an interesting thing that you said before we get to Tom and how he's filling his time. You talked about playing the trumpet the way you think it should be played or the way you want to approach the instrument. I think most people would think you play a trumpet, there's a technique, you learn how to do it, you do it, and then off you go playing pieces. So what do you mean by playing it in what is your way, or what is different, or what is personal about the instrument to you?
Well, the sonority. I think I've been exploring colors a lot more in my warm up because I get a lot more time to warm up. So I have been trying to find the exact sound that I want to create. A lot of times, warming up is about getting the face in place to do what I need to do for the day. But now, warming up is about finding my signature color if I want to find one or if I can. And then also expanding techniques like trying to make beautiful quarter tone glisses and grace notes for some of the pieces that I'm learning that are Hindustani based. And sort of, it's like I think about filling the red and building in the black. So I'm adding skills that are, extra and external that I've always wanted to try to explore. But I'm also really diving deep into personal things that I have always wanted to get better at. Some of them are very basic, and some of them are things that stem back from a long time. And I just haven't had the time to really adequately address them. They've been addressed, of course, but I want to dive deeper into those. So that's kind of what I mean with all that.
And Tom, we could think of this as a gift of time. We can think of this as a terrible time to be living through, and I'm sure there will be many videos that last for our descendants that talk about what a tough time this has been. But Jean is saying, and I think I agree with her, that there's also a gift of time that we don't normally have in our jobs. What are you doing with your time?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that, you know, we find ourselves in this position where we have all this extra time, and it happened obviously incredibly abruptly. We were all getting ready for a concert on that Wednesday night before they locked things down, and I went from being in a position where I had a lot of performances on the horizon, a lot of different performances with a lot of repertoire to practice, and not feeling like I had a lot of time, to very suddenly in the course of a day having a ton of time and nothing that I needed to practice in the sort of near term. So I've been thinking a lot about, if we were to anticipate this, if somebody were to say a year from now, you're going to have several months, 3-4 months potentially, where you can work on whatever you feel like you need to work on, or you can practice however you feel like you need to practice without any looming performances or without anything to prepare for. What would you do with that time, and what kinds of things would you want to leave that time with? So for me, in terms of my practice, I think that the ability to spend more time with fundamental types of practice and work on things about my playing that, maybe have been weaknesses in the past, or things that I wish were stronger aspects of my playing, taking on some sort of fundamental projects, playing through certain routines, playing through certain etude books that I've been meaning to do for a long time, but really haven't had a chance to. And then in addition to that, I'm just playing some repertoire that I really just like to play. I think it's really important for me to just spend some time playing music that I love. Jean, last year you said something really great in a class that I heard you do, where you said, when I'm not really feeling it, I play Bach. And I've been playing a lot of Bach recently. Just playing music that I love to play, playing music that is going to make me better, yeah, and that's a good project to work on, things that are productive, but also just playing the instrument because it's fun to play, and because it's important to remember that music is for beauty and for pleasure. And during this time, it doesn't all have to be productivity. It can just be, it feels good to do it. What are you up to, Dan?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned routines. One of the things that concerned me when we closed down our school was that our students would basically stop playing with any kind of structure, that it would feel like a vacation to them, and that they wouldn't continue the studies that we know they need to continue, because we're continuing our own practicing and studies of our instruments. And so our official shutdown came on Friday after that Wednesday concert was canceled. And that night I wrote out a 1 hour drill for my students, a routine that they could do every day that would cover as much of the many sides of brass playing and horn playing in particular as possible. And I set myself a goal of getting that routine published within 2 weeks. And I actually did it in 12 days. It was a huge project and very satisfying to go from idea to writing the drills to practicing the drills for about 4 days and changing them and altering them a little bit, and swapping out the order, trying to create a full 1 hour project that made sense for students, and then laying it out in Finale, transferring it over to a PDF, adding text. It was a pretty big project, and it felt good to get that out and get it to my students, and also to get to sell that at a very cheap price, but to the horn players out there in the world. And that got me on a practice jag of really working on this routine. And probably not surprisingly, most of the drills in the routine, it's called the daily drill for horn players. And most of the drills in there are things that I find hard and therefore need to drill. So I've been practicing a lot of very basic stuff. And as you guys know, for us, basic stuff means having a nice sound, having a colorful sound, Gene, like you're talking about, moving from one note to the next smoothly, being able to start a note clearly, being able to get louder evenly, get softer evenly, stay the same evenly, all those very, very basic things that make up music. I've had a blast practicing that stuff and then applying it to music, which I'm reading through like you're doing, Tom, just reading through different pieces. And now with the wonderful iPads that we all have, we can store a ton of music, because all my music is locked up in the humanities building, but I have a lot of music on my iPad and just playing through and enjoying. Is either of you finding that your musicianship is changing or developing or doing anything interesting or different?
I have to say, a lot of my practice is pretty structured, in any circumstance. So I have to say that I don't find myself changing much of what I'm doing or altering much of what I'm doing. I guess I tend to think about practice as happening in 3 different places. Basically, the music you have to prepare, the fundamental aspects of playing, and then, for me, an etude practice, a good diet of etudes. And I guess for me, it's just kind of shifted from having the things that I'm preparing be a pretty large percentage of what I'm working on, to having fundamentals and etudes taking a bigger percentage of my practice. So I have to say it's not something that I feel like my playing has changed or evolved, or that I have different goals. I'm really looking forward to the time when we're back to playing for people, and when we're back to playing together. And maybe it's naive to hold out hope that that happens sooner rather than later. But I'm kind of continuing to work with that mindset. How about you, Gene?
Yeah, I feel like I'm in a similar boat. I have one big bonus that I've noticed is I just feel good, chop wise and facially, because everything is on my own terms. And so one benefit that that has on musicality and how I feel personally like I'm changing is, when I naturally feel good, I naturally have more mental bandwidth to focus on expression and focus on musicality. So I've noticed a spike in that in my playing and in my, like my etude diet. A lot of times it just ends up being more musical, and I'm doing a lot of recording of myself, and I listen back to maybe the same etude that I recorded a while ago, and it's more free sounding, because a lot of times we emit musically how we feel so much more than we even know. And so I'm kind of like bookmarking that idea, and I'm going to really try hard to instill a sense of feeling really good even when things get busy again, prioritizing whatever I need to do to feel as good as I do now when I'm on my own terms. And the other thing that I'm discovering is I'm sort of returning to some roots. With a spacious time, I kind of am revisiting some pieces or some musical inspiration sources that I liked in high school. And one of those things, it seems a little bit, like a throwback to the 90s, but is like the vocal jazz riff. I've been really rediscovering these 90s artists and kind of thinking about a vocal riff and what that is, and how it applies to American culture, and how like the pop voice world can be kind of sort of crossed over. And so I'll like listen to an artist, try to do a riff that they offer on a recording, and then try to recreate that on my trumpet. And I don't usually play a lot of jazz, but that's been sort of my jazz lately. And I found that to be really, really fun, if not just humoring myself. So those are the two ways that I've sort of seen a musical change in myself. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned that because, I feel like my teaching changes from month to month. It's like it's slower than the tides. It's slower than the phases of the moon that it changes, but it's faster than the annual calendar. I get new ideas and incorporate them in. And one thing that we're talking about with the jazz vocal riffs is that I've started talking with students about when they're playing a phrase, about thinking about the words in that phrase.
Yeah.
So which part of this phrase is a word, and then where does the next word begin, and then where does the next word begin, so that they make a sentence, and there may not even be pauses between the words. Like I'm talking now, there's no pauses between the words, and yet we can understand where one word starts and one word stops. And I've been finding that that's very helpful to students, because they have a phrase of music, it starts here and it goes to here, and it's just a bunch of notes. And how do you turn that into something that makes sense? And for me, the answer is, well, you think of it as words. And that's been a thing that I've started to work on for myself. And uh, we're all still teaching, and that's a thing that works, teaching over Zoom or whatever teleconferencing
Yep.
package you're using. Is, yeah, we can't hear the actual sound of our students, but we can usually make out the phrasing. And so you ask them, where are the words, and then first they say what, and then they start getting it. It's like, oh yeah, well, the first word goes from the first note through the fifth note, and then there's a new word, but there's not a pause, and then there's a little comma in the sentence, and so on, and suddenly these phrases make sense. That kind of discovery, I mean, it's so exciting to me. It's one of the things that makes me excited to be a teacher, even in tough circumstances, is just the joy of having my eyes open to how music works more, and helping my students see that as well. So I think that teaching continues to be rewarding in spite of the screen freezing and the sound being terrible sometimes and all of that. There's much to be gained, and I just hope all our students are learning. I think they are.
I have to say, I think these couple of weeks, especially the 2 weeks previous to this week, I think have been some of the most productive weeks of teaching of the entire year. And it's just because people have been shaken out of their routine. And for me, for my students, it seems like this thing that we're all doing right now, and that I think we're all forced to do, this idea of self-teaching, and especially self-teaching through recording yourself a lot and having to submit recordings. I have my students submit recordings for studio class instead of doing a solo class live. Obviously, they're submitting their recordings, and so they have to record themselves and make a good recording to send to their colleagues for them to comment on. Likewise, for my lessons, all my students are recording repertoire in advance for us to talk about. So outside of my typical advice to them, which is make sure you're recording yourself, make sure you're recording yourself, make sure you're recording yourself, they're having to do it on a weekly basis and having to present it for people on a weekly basis. And truly, from the first week of recorded lessons and recorded submissions for studio class to the second week was across the board the most progress that I heard all year, without question. And some of it had to do with just people got better at doing recordings. People got better at where they put their mic. People got better microphones over the course of those 2 weeks in the mail and things like that. So part of it was that process, but that's important too, because the better we can hear ourselves, the easier it is to fix any issues with our playing that might come up, or the easier it is to make changes for the good. So I feel like this has been a very productive time, even given the circumstances.
Jean, are you having your students do some recording of themselves?
Yeah, yeah. Likewise, they're offering some recordings in similar ways, and we've tried to do a whole bunch of group recording too, and offering. There's a bunch of different platforms we've experimented on, like Acapella, BandLab, iMovie, and just like how can we cinch together a musical product and put it out there. But I think the Zoom lessons have been really wonderful because I can say, I'm hearing this thing that you're doing. Can you try it again? And I want you to go back and listen to the recording we're making and review that. And you can kind of do something you can't do in real life, or I haven't done yet. I'm sure things will change with the way I teach after we all come back. But you can bookmark a moment and say, I saw immense growth in those 3 seconds. And, it's like the 80-20 rule. Like 80% of our growth comes from 20% of our time. I mean, it's like there are these micro bursts of improvement that we can now pinpoint and say, you need to splice that and keep that forever and do this forever. And I found that to be enormously beneficial and also inspiring to me and as a teacher, and to hear my students making those sort of attention to detail upward movements. And then also I have my students send me recordings of conscious practice sessions. So they are out loud, like they're playing through a piece, and then they're listing what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, the problems that are in front of them, the hurdles they have to jump, and then at least 2 or 3 ways to approach that hurdle. And I'm hearing them work it out. And by doing that, I get to hear how they consciously approach their practicing. And then one huge benefit to me as a teacher is I know now what I don't have to tell them in lessons because I hear them doing it. And so it saves both of us so much time if I don't have to be like, are you able to sing these intervals? And it's clear from the practice session that they are. Also, one final thought is that having a series of guests, there's guests have more time and we're able to invite some friends in to talk to our students. There's a lot of like constant reaffirmation of certain teaching mantras that you hear your other professionals offering your students. And it's sort of like in reinforcing things that are just, it's nice. I'm sure it's nice to hear it from multiple sources. I remember when I was a student, it really clicked, if 5 people said it and they all have jobs, maybe I should do it. So, those are some of many benefits that I've seen out of this.
Yeah, I think your point about, having those bookmark moments and lessons is so important because I think when we're teaching, or I should say, especially when we're learning, we're trying so hard to do well. From your experiences playing in lessons that you're just trying to do well. You're trying to sound good, and this person is trying to show you how to sound good. So when you do your next repetition, you just want to do better, and you want to do better, and you want to do better. And of course, that's important. But on the flip side, sometimes these really important moments where something hits home or you made some change, sometimes we miss those as learners because we're so busy thinking about trying to do well or trying to do better the next time. And right now, when we're in this process of self-learning and when we're dealing with this technology where we can just go like, hey, listen to 30 seconds ago, listen to what you just did there. That's a really important thing. And that's a really important thing I think we'll take into teaching after all this is over. Sorry, I cut you off, Dan.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Jean.
Well, I was just going to kind of add on to that and kind of bring it back to the opportunity to have a little more time. I've had a little more time to explore other skills and to be a beginner again at different things. And when, if I'm being helped or instructed or I'm following a tutorial online, I get frustrated as a learner of that skill because in that moment I want to do it, but I can't, and I don't have the conscious bandwidth to break it down and analyze it as I would in a separate practice session. I want to get it done. And it's kind of put me in the shoes of what it's like to be a learner and a beginner at something. And it's been really, it offers more empathy, at least to me as a teacher. What about you, Dan?
That's a great segue into what I wanted to talk about, which is, as you guys know, we can keep on teaching. I'm teaching, in the fourth quarter of the year, I teach the horn to music ed majors who don't play the horn. I can still do that over Zoom. There's various things we can do. We can have guests in our studio classes, which we're all doing. And the one thing that's really hard to continue doing is the Wisconsin Brass Quintet, which as both of you know is one of the wonderful, wonderful things about our jobs is that we get to play together. And now we can't be together. And I want to talk, even though you guys might want to forget it, about a failure that we had, which was that we tried to record Varsity line by line and edit it together into something that we could release. And as we all three agreed, it was a complete disaster. And it was fascinating for me, a real learning experience, which is why I'm bringing it up, to see that there's some kind of magic when you're together. And maybe you guys can talk about it, but to me, it's some combination of just humans being together, but also the kind of physical body motion communication, that we all develop to cue each other and have body language in our playing, something about the instant adjustments that we make when we're playing together to get it in tune and to get the volume balanced. And when you separate the 5 lines and record them one by one and stack them, and then even edit them to make sure they line up, what you get is a mud pie. And that was just a confirmation to me of the magic of chamber music. And it's very hard to describe, but I'm hoping we can describe it for people. Jean, you play in a wonderful brass quintet in Seraph, and you guys have a magic, I'm sure. And can you talk about that? And then Tom, afterwards, you play in so many different kinds of groups. Why do we musicians love playing in small groups? What are we getting out of that?
Well, with Seraph and with WBQ, I think the magic comes from kind of one of the first things that I think was mentioned, which is this idea of color and matching color. Like it just feels like we're trying to make a painting from afar. Like it's not about the colors you use, it's about how you bring them together, right? And so the one thing I love about playing with Seraph and WBQ is that it's two very different color palettes, and the challenge and exciting opportunity to step in and try to paint differently and try to figure out how to fit in is just so exciting. And I don't know what the number is when it starts being hard, when there's too many people, but my goodness, playing with four other people it really does feel magical. Also, one thing I learned from the WBQ attempt to come together without coming together is there's and this is a great reminder of you could have the simplest line like a dotted quarter followed by an eighth, and that can be interpreted in so many different ways. And there's this like subtle subconscious language that happens with chamber music that has more depth to it in my mind than just reading body language in a conversation. It's like that, but even more deep, because you're listening to, yes, you're listening to tone in a conversation, but it's also, you're listening to this visceral, emotive offering from somebody else, and you're trying to grab onto it and then connect and then blend with it. And it's just so hard to do from afar. And the digital platforms that are better at it are the ones where you really can feel like you're playing with them. But it just felt so wrong to hear all of us playing for ourselves and try to bring it together. And it was amazing how different it was from when we're actually together. So, I mean, thank God, right? Thank God this project failed, because it validates our job and why we do what we do together in real life.
Up the
So
same
yeah.
way, which is why I raised the question. Totally.
Yeah. I don't know. What about you, Tom?
Well, I was gonna say there's just such a social element to what it is that we do, and that is so evident in the music and how the music is created and what we value about the music and value about the musical experience. I love playing solo stuff and I love playing in orchestras, but what I love about chamber music is that you're a soloist in an ensemble. There's nowhere to hide. There's no, laying back and letting the violins do the work, but at the same time, it's not all about you. You have to find a communion with other people. And I think that's the magic. And obviously we didn't have that magic. I played the first part of that, and I'm sure it was weird to try to play with me, but I bet it was even weirder for me to try to not play with anybody else that I was meant to be hearing in my head. That's not a good feeling, actually. It was way harder than I anticipated, and it's something that I really have no desire to try to fix or to try to solve. We also, as a group, kind of discussed, well, what if we tried this in one of those other platforms? What if we tried this with a click track? What if we tried to make this happen, given the tools that we have? And all kind of came to the agreement that it's not going to sound like a human. There's a humanity to the pace that you play it with, to bending time, to playing it together but not perfectly in time, and we would lose that. And so without that social element, without that coming together in the moment and creating the moment, I don't know. I think it loses enough that it's hardly worth the effort. So
Yeah. The magic is gone, that's for sure.
yeah, and I have to say, I mean, it feels kind of silly saying this. I mean, Jean, you've been a part of several really great videos that do this. A lot of friends are posting things where they're doing duets, where they're doing awesome, jazz combos, even orchestras playing these things. So I don't at all mean to say those people shouldn't be doing that, or that those aren't valid, or that they're not great, or that they're not doing a good job with them. I just think for me, the experience of it was less than desirable, I'll say, personally.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with that completely. And actually, one of the projects I've done in the last week was to record. Uh, I had done an arrangement for my horn choir of "The Great Gig in the Sky," a Pink Floyd tune, because we are, as you guys know, a rock band in the spring semester, and everyone does an arrangement, and now nobody's arrangement gets to be played. So I decided to record all 9 parts of my arrangement, and I, of course, started, as we did with our WBQ attempt, I started with the lowest line, since obviously that lowest line sets the intonation and sets the time in many ways. And then I stacked the parts up, and I found that the people who had recorded the parts previous to the one I was playing, say I was playing the 5th part, I just couldn't follow them at all. And they were me,
Yeah.
and I couldn't even follow me. And it was, I eventually, I was able to edit some things and make it work, but it's even us playing one line and then playing another line that's supposed to fit with the first one, Time is so fluid. We think of it as, well, put your metronome on and time is fixed, but no, time has infinite subdivisions and it is a fluid and moving thing. Um, and and that's what makes music so wonderful. And you can now program a MIDI device to play any piece of music. You program the notes in, and you can program the dynamics and the sound to a degree, but it's still not a living, breathing thing. And time has to breathe, and you can't do it in five separate strands. You can't. But I would also add that I've played in WBQ now for however many years I've been here, 9, 10 years. But I've played in the Meridian Arts Ensemble for 31 years. And that's a long time to be mostly with the same people. And it's fascinating because for that group, it moves at the same pace for us when we're together. And that's just the magic of having been together. It's like a couple that finishes each other's sentences. And when you take the live out of live music, that's one of the things that dies. Is that's no longer there.
I like to think of us as like very high level synchronized swimmers.
Without the makeup, maybe.
I don't know. I think the top bun for everybody.
So, Tom, what do you, when you're practicing, do you have a goal? Like, do you think of sound color, or do you think of not missing anything, or do you think of beauty? What are you going, what does it mean to practice? A lot of people, everyone knows we practice, but what the hell are we doing when we practice?
I tend not to think in specifics. I just had this conversation with a student yesterday, actually. And it's actually a difficult thing for me to describe because I think it's so simple that it almost stifles conversation about it. What I have in my head is I have an idea of how I want something to sound. And that can be based on many things. It could be based on, if I'm working on my tone, it could be based on how I want my sound itself to sound. If I'm working on a specific piece of repertoire, it can be based on some recordings that I've listened to or some master of that kind of repertoire that I have in my head. But really, my whole practice is based around the idea that I'm trying to get the thing that comes out to sound the thing that's in my head. This is why, to me, the recording practice is so important. Is it's a process of calibrating. When I put this thought into my instrument, what comes out? Okay, I hear this happening, and now I'm hearing that this note's not quite as long. I'm not hearing it through the recording as being as long as I thought I was putting it into the instrument. Okay, well, now I'm going to calibrate my imagination and try to steer what's going on in my head so that the result is more like what's going on in my head, what I want it to sound like. So to me, it's really that simple. How is this meant to go? How is this meant to sound? And I think, again, that it's such a stripped down concept that if we could just kind of say that on day one of lessons freshman year and students could really understand that, we'd be out of a job. Because that's really what it's about. After, with every other complicating factor we want to add in, it's how can you sound more like the way that you want to sound in your head?
Jean, do you have something like that going on when you're practicing?
Yeah, I do. I have kind of two things that are going on. But of course, the overarching mantra is how can I get to the point where I'm sounding the way I want to sound? And a throwback question to Tom out of my curiosity would be, well, where is that sound in your head born from? Like where does that come from, and how have you thought that's developed over time, and have you witnessed it develop over time? Because I feel like my internal sound differs from day to day sometimes. Or, as Dan says, from moon to moon. So, I mean, is it okay to rebound that question back to you, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I think of myself as having an anthology to draw from. And that anthology is my experience as a listener and my experience as somebody who loves music, and trying to connect that back to what I'm doing. I think there are times where I'm thinking about, sounding good on the tuba. Certainly when I'm thinking about really specific, exercises in regard to tone, or just like, really trying to distill down what does this actual sound need to sound like. But in general, I'm drawing from my influences. I'm drawing from all the things that I like as a listener, and I'm trying to recreate those things as a player. Um, for this reason, I think if I could go back and do it again, I would start listening more earlier and make listening a bigger part of my practice. Um, because I really feel like without that anthology, without those influences, without understanding what I want to sound like in any given style and being informed in what I want to sound like, without that, it's pretty much lost. I feel like if you don't have a good concept in there, it's really hard to kind of come up with your own. But if you can base it off of all these various influences, then it just becomes, I don't know, alchemy.
Well, you guys are talking about something that I think about a lot that I think is really important in our talk about music, and that is that. So I define art as the product of the imagination made real.
Yeah.
And that presupposes a lot of things, though. It presupposes, for instance, that you apply your imagination. Do you know how to do that? You have a printed line of music. It's a bunch of dots and lines and arcs and letters, and somehow that has to make you think of something.
Yeah.
That has to give you an idea. And that's where the listening that you're talking about really comes into play. That stuff's got to mean something, and in order for it to mean something, you got to have some history with style, and style's a real thing. If you listen to a high school brass quintet play a piece of Renaissance music, not knowing about style, and you realize how important style can be. But there's other presuppositions there too, which is that so you have something in your mind, and you want to make it real, so you play it. Well, did it come out the way you wanted, or didn't it? Well, I don't know. I was really busy playing,
Yeah.
so I don't know. And we don't have enough RAM in our heads to play and listen at the same. Maybe it's a constant labor for musicians. I think it's why we have to practice so much, that we just don't have the available brain power to be able to really listen, which is why you guys are talking about, my students, their brains are getting exploded because they're recording themselves and listening, and they can't, they're getting better because they can't believe what they sounded like. And um, I think we're not out of a job for precisely the reason that guiding somebody, a student, even the most talented student, even the most talented doctoral student, and opening them up to thinking creatively about how something should sound, and then helping them to discover, because you can't pour knowledge into anybody's head, but helping them to discover the tools that they need. And that's all the technique is just the tools you need to make what's in here come out the bell of your instrument. Nothing else. God did not create the tuba with an instruction manual of how to play it, where we make it up as we have new music to play. And then the concentration needed to analyze the results. And it takes a guide. It takes a guide to do that, and that's what can be frustrating is when the student plays and you can't hear it because your screen froze or whatever. But it just shows all the more how we're engaging with these various issues with our students, and hopefully they're engaging back and having their minds explode every week from ideas that they never would have thought of, which is what I feel like when I go to Wisconsin Brass Quintet rehearsals and hear all you guys play. And it's like, whoa, I never would have thought to, but I want to do it that way. That's so cool. Now I got to go practice. Even just listening to the two of you talk, I want to pick up my horn and do a little practicing, because it's inspiring even to talk about these ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about, Dan, in terms of having limited cognitive resources and really only being able to concentrate on one thing at a time, I think it's a limitation in some ways, but I think it's a superpower in other ways. If you can really harness that ability to lock in focus and realize that you can only think about one thing at a time. Oftentimes when talking to students, students will say things like, oh, you're trying to do this with my air here, or I'm trying to do this with my chops here, or I'm trying to do this and this and this. And then I'll just ask them, well, how do you want it to sound? realizing that if you're thinking about your air, you might think that you're thinking about sounding good, but you can't be. You can only be thinking about your air. You can, like any good multitasker, flip very quickly back and forth between air, sound, air, sound, air, sound. But you really can only think about one thing at a time. So if we can harness this ability, if we can harness this limitation and make it into a superpower of one-track mind, realizing what we need to be thinking about when we need to be thinking about it, I think that's how we can kind of turn it around. But yeah, I think it obviously helps to be able to, use recording as a way to, it's kind of like an external hard drive. You don't have to be worried about what you're doing in the moment because you know that a couple seconds from now you can go listen to it. That's really important.
Yeah, and to add to that, somebody had mentioned an etude diet before, and if you look online, there's all these ways to break up how you play etudes or how you do fundamentals or routines. But for me, what I find as far as an approach to etude is not what etudes am I playing, not what repertoire am I playing, but how am I thinking about my approach. And one fun game I've been playing with myself in my practice is in etude work specifically is this one track mind idea. It's like, because I think about like there's infinite different ways to listen, but like I think of like the 5 pillars of you listen deeply to the intervals, or you listen deeply to the sound you're putting out in the moment, or you're listening deeply to the sound you'd like to put out. Like, can I sing my idol's sound in my head while I play? Or you're listening down to the harmony, or you're listening across. If you're playing in chamber music, you're taking your ears like Inspector Gadget style and unplugging them from yourself. And I like to like insert those 5 different forms of listening into 5 different etudes. And it's like something we never do since we play one tone at a time. It's so easy to forget about the harmonic structure of an etude, and even if there isn't an accompaniment part written, it's there. And so feel the harmonies move as you play, and like I feel like if I do that, the technical side and the air, that will automatically support the higher goal that is sought by doing ear practice and listening practice.
Yeah, this idea of practicing is so deep, and there are so many different people think different ways about it. And I had an interesting experience. I've been having lots of guests at my studio class because this is an opportunity to get somebody. Actually, I'm sure we're all going to continue doing this when the pandemic is over. It's like now we know how to video conference, and we can have people from all over the world come and talk to our students, and all they have to give up is 50 minutes of their time. But so I've been having a bunch of friends come in and who are incredibly accomplished musicians. And last week, I had an old friend who's an oboe player, and she has these great ideas about practicing. And she turns her pieces, she plays a lot of new music, and it's very hard. And she plays it brilliantly, and she turns the pieces themselves into etudes. So she doesn't do an etude, she's playing piece by somebody, and it's really hard. And so first she'll play it, and every note is a quarter note, and they're all slurred. So it's some passage that has 5 notes over 2.5 beats, but none of that matters. I'm just going to get the pitches, and I'm going to practice till I know that sequence of pitches. And then another thing she'll do is she'll play the first note long. Doesn't matter what the rhythm of the piece is. The first note you play long, and then the next 3 notes you play as fast as you can, and the next note you play long, and then 3 notes really fast. And you're ignoring the rhythm of the piece, but just getting the pitchiness of the piece into your head. And then she's got all kinds of methods like that I never thought of, and some of them, playing the next 3 notes really fast can be hard on the horn, but compared to the oboe, but so what? It's a cool technique. And so, mind's blown. Wow, we can practice in different ways than we ever thought of. And slowing it down is one way out of an entire cauldron full of ways. And then I had... yesterday, we had as you guys know, we're all on the same schedule. We had studio class, and I had a former colleague from New York who's now has a huge job with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And he was talking about auditioning, and he said, and he boiled it down. He said, intonation. And it was the complete opposite of what my previous guest had said. It was like, look, you have to play in tune. So Tom, it's sort of like what you're talking about, that you come up with this idea, and then there's another idea in a different room, in a different house, in a different town, in a different country, on a different planet, and they're both valid. And I think my students were like, boom, 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 like all this information that's different, but they're both right, right?
Yeah.
They're both like, yeah, it's true. If you go to an orchestra audition and you play out of tune, you're done. Period. So you better learn how to play in tune. And so with our one track mind, we better spend some time thinking about our intonation. But then on the other hand, we play a lot of hard music. And if you can't play the sequence of notes, you better figure out a method to teach yourself how to do it, and do it fast, because there's lots to do out there. So I'm fascinated by all this stuff. It's like we should be writing books based on just what we're learning during the pandemic about brass playing.
I think creativity in practice is so important. You know, so often students will come to me and they say, I'm really struggling with this lick. And I'll say, what did you do to practice it? But, I don't want to repeat anything that you've already worked on. And they'll say, well, I did X, Y, and Z. And that's what you told me to do on this lick. And I'll say, yeah, but this is something totally different. You need to try something different. It's not going to work to slow this down, because that's not the problem. The problem isn't that you don't hear your sound doing this. It's not that you're not noticing something. It's that you have to work on this motor skill, or you have to work on this thing happening fast. So there is no one size fits all. But Jean, what I really liked about what you had to say is thinking about it in terms of what are you thinking about? What are you focusing on? And it actually reminds me of a story, an experience that I had at the beginning of all this mess, when it was hard to kind of pull away from the news and do anything productive on the instrument. And I was practicing stuff that I genuinely enjoyed playing, and realizing that I was just sounding terrible because I was trying to practice and be productive. And I forgot that I wanted to sound good. I forgot that I was trying to play something beautiful, and forgot that I needed to play it beautifully. And just my head being in the slightly different place, it made my playing an absolute mess. So having creativity, not only in terms of the techniques that you have, but in terms of understanding what your thought process and your mindset, what that does to your playing, is, I think, a really important part of the art of practicing.
Jean, do you feel that even though none of us probably going to play a concert in the next 4 months or so, do you feel like you can practice and find some peace, that you're devoting time of your life to it and learning? And is it nourishing to you? Does it feel creative? What's going through your head?
Yeah, well, I feel totally fulfilled artistically at the moment. There is an end date to that. At the end of the day, the magic has got to happen in the room with the people. But for now, I have so much invigoration, I guess, that comes from putting down on paper a bunch of swirling ideas that have been in my head. And so even if it just means I'm learning to arrange some for a different instrument, which, like I recently tried an arrangement. That was cool. Then now I'm trying to think about the idea of writing. I'm in a situation where I have to actually, because of the pandemic, totally shift my research. And I'm going to have to write a portion of the show, and I haven't composed much. And so I'm very excited about the opportunity to look up that mountain and see where it brings me. And I also, there's this really geeky Facebook page made by a few, other professors from other universities, but it's a trumpet page, and every day they post a piece of music. It's sometimes an orchestral excerpt. I always sort of back out of those. It's not my vein, but there's oftentimes a portion of a solo or a creative opportunity to post something that is not for the originally for the trumpet. And every day there's an assignment, and then people are voting on what they want the next assignment to be. And it's this beautiful space where people can come together, some orchestra musicians, some professors, and a whole bunch of students. And we're all on this equal digital platform. And it's like this studio class of 800 strong or more. And you post a video, and it's just like everybody is showing themselves in progress, because you don't get weeks to prepare. You get literally not even a day. And I mean, there's no rules, but it's kind of exciting and terrifying. And it's been really fun for me to, I've tampered with it. I've done maybe 3 recordings, but I've seen my students do some, and it's offered like a little bit of fuel, and the other fuel comes from like these future projects. And I just I know that I feel like I worry so much about trying to find a color and expressiveness, but I also totally nerd out about the analytical side. And I enjoy making spreadsheets, and I like to like flip the coin. And in my practicing, there's a method called calisthenics, and kind of explore. It's always sound based, and it's always about what I'm trying to obtain with my sound, but it's very mathematical in a lot of ways. And I like to break it down like that. But then I actually, I ended up having to take a year and a half off the trumpet in my early 20s because I had gotten an injury, and when I was coming back, I couldn't just focus on how I sounded and how I wanted to sound, because the ability to recreate what the sound I had in my head was zero. And so I had to figure out how to insert some conscious thought, but then I went absolutely nuts, and I just had to put the horn down because there was no expressivity in it. And so I find that the sort of resulting mindset from that time of my life has been this feeling of the coin flip of like, all right, now I'm kind of like analyzing it, and I'm approaching it like a scientific method: procedure, observation, data, hypothesis. Procedure, observation, and the people who get the best are the people who have the best procedures, and the best questions. And then the other side is just kind of like flowing with whatever inspiring projects there are. So I know that's a long answer, but yeah, that's kind of like how I feel like I've stayed inspired so far. I don't know. Do either of you feel like there's a moment where we're just going to have to get back together in order to keep that inspiration up?
It's certainly going to be take an effort of will to keep this going, depending on how long this goes. But we're musicians. We're used to sitting in a room alone and getting something done. And by the way, our students are getting used to that too, and that is such an amazing skill, no matter where they end up. So I think we're going to be able to do it, and I think it's going to force some people into creativity because maybe they'll get a little bored, and they'll not want to play scales all the time, so they'll do an arrangement or they'll write a piece. And all you have to do to write a piece is start writing a piece. And then after a certain time, you put a double bar and your piece is over. Now you're a composer. And being alone is a great time to do that because you know that there's no one there to judge. It can be a piece that's very private for the moment. That's how I started writing. I just started writing, and because I had some time to do it. So I do think we can do it. And I think maybe come out the better for it. Certainly, like we're talking about, a renewed appreciation for the incredibleness of playing together with people, whether a small group or a medium or big group. But also, we're all going to have new skills because we're practicing and working hard, and we want to trot those out and show the stuff that we're learning. And I think that's a good thing too. So, in the fall semester, I had a sabbatical, as you guys know, and I was in Paris, and I was studying some stuff and practicing also, and experiencing Paris, and having a semester to recharge. And then I came home and taught for half a semester, and now we're teaching, but we're also sort of on sabbatical, and it can be a recharge for us too. And even if it goes through a whole year beyond this one, I think we'll figure out how to create music and how to become better musicians. Tom, what do you think? Are you an optimist like me?
I totally agree with all of that, and I'm myself finding that, I do think that this can be a productive way, or a productive time in a way that it otherwise couldn't be. But I also feel like there is a pressure to make this time productive. And I think that pressure can be kind of challenging for some people. I feel like in times like this, there are certain people who just really ramp up what they're doing and fill the time that they have with things that they're working on. And I think there are other people who are kind of, whether it's other kinds of anxiety that people are experiencing during this time, or just that pressure that you have to be doing things, you have to be producing, you have to be creating, you have to be practicing in a new way and learning all these skills. I do think it's actually important to that we all just kind of make peace with what we are doing and be comfortable with this new situation. And also, I think, frankly, with some of my students, it's just giving them permission to say, you don't need to compose 5 pieces every week and do 6 arrangements and post 10 videos to Facebook. You can be working on yourself, working on your craft, working on your art without feeling that pressure. So I think there's another side to that coin, and certainly different ways of dealing with this time. And I kind of go back to this idea that at a certain point, this is going to be over. And I think that we can think about, at that point, what will we have wanted to do? Whenever that time is, what will we have wanted to do? And I don't know, catching up on some of your reading lists is an important thing to do as well. Working on yourself, taking time to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. All of that stuff is very important to me.
I think that stuff comes out in the music that we play too.
Yeah.
So we're not machines that generate sound. We are human beings with emotions, and our emotional response to things is almost always legitimate.
Yeah, and I just want to add amen to that. And also, if people are seeing whatever's happening on the social media platforms or listening to this, I think it's important to not forget to mention that I think all of the projects that have been mentioned tonight, or like the inspired practice, has probably occurred and been born from more sleep, more time to cook, more quality time with our loved ones. It's like, and if you need more, take more. And it's kind of like figuring out and being totally okay. I put the trumpet down for 10 solid days starting at spring break, and it was beautiful because there was no fear of, oh gosh, I have to get back in shape really quickly and not hurt myself. And I just think that, yeah, like spending time with loved ones, especially, I'm definitely finding inspiration from this recalibration. And I'm going to try to really hope to instill that as we go forward. If things turn back to quote normal, I don't want to forget how many beautiful practice sessions that happened because I ate a nice meal and had 8 hours of sleep.
There's an
Absolutely.
aspect of this that reminds me of what it's like to show up at an orchestral audition and hear everybody warming up, where you sit down in a room and it's all a bunch of people trying to impress each other, or they're playing really impressive things, and you just sit back and you listen and you think, man, what am I doing here? I can't do what that person's doing, because they're playing that thing that they've used to warm up and show off and be impressive every day for the last 10 or 15 years, and you've never tried it. So of course it's going to sound impressive. And I think people are seeing that with what's happening in social media, or people talking about how productive this time is. They're thinking, at least some students that I've talked to, and I think I've to an extent have experienced this myself, thinking, man, I don't, if I put out a video every day, I don't think I could sound that good. And it's just because we have a different way of experiencing what other people are doing as opposed to what we put out into the world. And we have a different way of listening to other people's recordings than we do of listening to ourselves. So I do think it's important that people react to this time and spend this time how they need to, and the way that's productive for them and the way that's going to be meaningful for them.
As you both know, we polled our students and asked them. We told them we were going to be having this conversation and asked if there were any topics that they wanted to discuss, and they had lots of great ideas. And I think this question, which is about teaching, is kind of apropos of what we're talking about, because we've been talking about ourselves and how we're dealing with what's happening now and how we hear music and how what our goals are and how we practice and stuff. This question is, what do you think the average music major needs to do more of? And I will say, I won't allow either of you to say practice as the answer.
Listen,
To what?
anything. Listen to anything that is inspiring. You can learn so much from any different style of music, and you can apply it to most anything that you can think of on the instrument. I would say if I was gonna pick like one thing, listen to great singers. And I don't care about the style. I don't care if it's great jazz singers. I don't care if it's great opera singers. I don't care if it's great Broadway singers. Listen to singers.
You can also, by the way, listen about once every year or two. I listen to the "I Have a Dream" speech.
Oh,
It's that is so. I mean, the delivery is so
Pacing.
musical. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It can even be spoken word. What about you, Gene? What do you think that the average music major needs to do more of?
create and um, slowly carve a niche. And by create, I don't mean compose necessarily. I don't mean like just do something that sets you apart. Because we're all kind of trying to sound correct and right and like what is a quote good sound. And I think that for me personally, something that I really like when I feel most inspired is when I'm doing something that where I'm not following in somebody's footsteps, even if it's really simple, like smashing together a children's book and a trumpet concerto, and morphing them together. It's not that hard. Somebody told me that one definition of creativity is pairing together two seemingly separate things. And just do that. Pick what you love, like a piece you love and something else you like, smash them together, figure out how you can make something new out of that. And then you can kind of offer a little bit of an artistic fingerprint that isn't just copying or trying to replicate. And I feel like someone, when I was in undergrad, someone once was like, "Oh, you're a music major. You must be so creative." And I thought about it. I was like, "No, I'm expressive. I'm not creative at all. Like nothing I'm doing is creating because I'm just taking things that other people create and trying to interpret and express it." And then I got really sad and I was like, "Oh, I want to be creative." So I really believe that is important and it's never too early. What about you, Dan?
Well, my answer is really similar to both of your answers. My answer is imagine. So we're trained to do what we're told. Our music says B flat half note, so we play a B flat for 2 beats, and it says forte, so we play it loud. We do what we're told. When I was in France, I went to the horn class at the conservatory, and the professor is this incredible horn player, and he plays principal horn in the Paris Orchestra. And I was asking about that, and he said, "We're soldiers. We do what we're told." And I found it a little sad, but also very much true. But I think in terms of our students' individual musical life, it can't be that you look at the note and it says F sharp and a P, and so they just say, "I have to learn how to play quietly on an F sharp." It has to be, and I don't know if you want to call it musical or interpretive or creative or what, but there has to be a notion that goes through their imagination of exactly what that should sound like. It's sort of I guess maybe I'm cheating because I'm amalgamating both of your answers, but I think as in so many things, we're all on this pretty much the same page on these things. They have to, you have to look at a piece of music with your eyes, and it goes into your head, and it comes out as, I was going to say an image. That's a sight word. We don't have a sound word for image. Doesn't exist in the language, but a soundage. Just look at a piece of music and create a soundage for it that's theirs. And then that's the hard part. From there on, it's just comparing. Did it sound like your soundage or didn't it?
What I love about both of your answers is that as students, I think the typical mindset is I have to get to a certain point and then I'll be good enough to do X, Y, and Z. And I think there's some benefit to that, to have that mindset because it keeps you striving. But on the other hand, it stifles all of the important things that we do as musicians. And there is no bar. There's no, once I get good enough, I'm there and I can do all these exciting, interesting, creative things. You have to do the exciting, interesting, creative things, and that makes you better, of course. But also, then you're doing the stuff. You're doing the creative. You're engaged with the creative process, and that's an important part of being a musician. Way beyond just having the ability level that's requisite for an audition or for a job or whatever it is.
Our the musical lines of descent that led to the three of us all go to the New York Brass Quintet. We all either studied with members of the group or studied with people who studied with members of the group. And the trombone player in that group was John Swallow, and he was an amazing guy. And he always said, the style comes before the music. The style determines the technique. The technique does not determine the style. He said it with a lot more four-letter words interspersed, and it doesn't quite sound like him without that, but it's exactly the same idea. If you're playing a piece of Renaissance music, and you know that style, that you know that those eighth notes are supposed to go bum, 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 and not ta, 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 ta. And so you make them go bum, 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 bum. You figure out how to make them sound. But that's technique. That's a piece of technique. And you don't ever, or usually, you don't even have to ask, how do you do that? You just do it until it sounds like your soundage of it. It sounds like your image of it. It sounds like it's supposed to sound. And Tom, like you said, that requires listening so you know the style. And Jean, like you say, you got to have stuff in your head. You got to think creatively about what does this mean to me? And you do those things, and suddenly you're a musician, and you're better than you were yesterday, which is exciting.
Yeah. I like to think of this as a top-down process where you start with the highest level concepts and you let those give you the sort of lower level ideas, lower level concepts, lower level techniques. So I will do a exercise with my students sometime where I'll say, pick your favorite recording of this piece, or pick your favorite musician that you could ever hear play this piece. Your favorite euphonium player, your favorite tuba player, your favorite cellist, doesn't matter. Okay, listen to this first, 8-bar phrase and tell me what kind of articulation they used here. And they may not know that from they may not have a recording of that person playing this particular piece, or they may not have a definitive memory of them doing this. But what that is accessing is if this sounded in my ideal version of this, what does this sound like? What decision would I make if I knew how this thing went? And if you can kind of base it in, what does this person who you have a ton of respect for, who you really enjoy their performances or whatever, what would that person do? It gives you this instant model, and all of a sudden, all your other decisions are made. Note lengths, articulations, phrasing, that's already done. You've already figured that out because you're hearing this other person do it. And of course, that's just you doing it in your own imagination, but it's just a way of accessing it. So yeah, starting with style.
And I would propose very quickly, Gene, and then I'll let you in, but I would propose, I guess it's a contrapositive to that, except that it just went out of my head what I was going to say. So, Gene, you talk while I recover that.
Well, I was just going to share an analogy that I really liked, or I guess I like now because it involves dogs. Someone once told me, well, if you're walking a dog, there are three ingredients: a dog, a leash, and a human. And the human should be the ear in the imagination. And the leash is the instrument, and the dog is the technique. And you got to teach it to sit, and you got to teach it to heel, and you got to train it. But a lot of times, our technique is walking our ear, and the ear is listening for where we messed up, or what cracked, or what didn't sound good, and it feels so reversed. And anyways, I just wanted to share the puppy analogy.
I like it. And I thought of my contrapositive, actually, which is,
What is it?
listen to a recording you don't like.
Yeah.
What you like about it? What struck you as wrong? That's such a good way to focus your thoughts on, no, it doesn't go that way. It goes this way, and now you're off and running.
Mm-hmm.
Not to bring this back up again, but this is another thing that I find about when you do record yourself, or when a student does record themselves. It's kind of like when you listen to your voice back on an answering machine or something. And of course, everybody else knows what you sound like, but you have this own idea of what you sound like. And when you hear what you actually sound like, it kind of rubs you the wrong way. And likewise, when you're playing, you can play something and you can play it very well, but if it's not aligning with your real idea of what this is meant to sound like, even something that's technically right or something that's technically good, if it's not aligning with what you think it's meant to sound like, you hear it as wrong. So, you know, once you take that process away, you do, if you're doing it right, you have an idea in your head of what you want, and then it's just a matter of matching it.
Let me throw out another question from a student, and I have a feeling I know where everyone's going to go with this, but this is a much more nuts and bolts question. How do you develop ear and pitch? I guess someone can start by interpreting that question, ear and pitch. What do you think is meant by that, and where would you go with that?
I would say pitch is probably an external stimulus where it's like, how do we match each other, right? When are we sharp and flat to each other? An ear is more like, the way I'm interpreting it is more internal, like how do you sound according to how you want to sound and according to what the music's asking for, and then your interpretation of that. And I used to, when I was at Northwestern, I would totally just botch through my ear training homework. I just, I didn't have the time of day for it. I thought I was good at it. And I would actually just kind of like do it with friends and just let them take the lead. And the person who was always kind of leading this homework group that we had was someone who was like, just found it fun and interesting. That person got so much better at their instrument that year. And by the end of that year, I kind of realized that I had just let my ear become stale. I mean, not my expressive ear, not my listening ear and my emotive ear, but my actual trained sort of prescription ear. And there was a clear moment my senior year where I realized like that I had just not developed it the way I wanted to. And so I started actually ear training and singing all of my repertoire and applying that. Interval training, singing with the piano, hearing chords. There's a really good website called Teoria. It's a little bit archaic in its structure, but it's got some really good exercises. And you can develop your ear in so many different ways. And my ability to walk my dog, my technical dog, skyrocketed after I started working on that. And I wasn't even touching the trumpet. So, I mean, I was still practicing, but you know what I mean. And so I interpret that question to be like, how can we develop our own inner ear? And then of course there's listening. And when you're playing with a group, I always think of pitch as an exploration, not as here's the tuner, here's where the dial is, like I'm right, you're wrong, etc. But like how it's usually, if I start thinking about sharp and flat, it gets worse. But I start thinking about colors, bright or dark or sizzly or velvety, and oftentimes that yields a much better result in that sort of exploration of textures. And so I guess there's one is a little bit more analytical and one is a little bit more expressive and exploratory. But what about you, Tom?
I think for me, it really does come down to the ability to sing and the ability or the training that goes into sight singing. Oftentimes, if I have a student who's struggling with a certain pitch or struggling with intonation or even struggling with accuracy, especially, I'll ask them the question of, how would you find this note if you had to sight sing this? What would you relate it to? What does that process look like in terms of you're given this pitch to start and you have to sing this pitch? How do you hear it? And that, exactly like you said, Jean, that's the biggest technique. Along with that, in relation to pitch as it functions with an instrument in an ensemble, to me it's always important to keep in mind the relationship between tone and pitch, meaning that you can play a note that's perfectly in tune with a bad sound and it will sound wrong. Likewise, you can play or on the contrary, you can play a note that's slightly out of tune, but it sounds correct. It sounds robust. It has that sort of Velcro quality that allows other sounds to adhere to it. And that sounds right. So it's important to consider that pitch and tone are related, part and parcel. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, well, I think everything that you guys think, and you make it hard to go third, the two of you. But I will say a couple things. First of all, for if there's people watching this conversation who aren't brass players, talking about pitch as intonation, as being in tune or out of tune. High or low. High is sharp, low is flat. In tune is in tune, and we all know when we hear it. If you're playing a cello, you have your finger here, it's on the string right here. And if you want it to be to change pitch, you move it this way or you move it this way. It's as simple as that. And we don't have that so much on brass instruments. Everything, as you guys know, it happens inside, and it's this very delicate balance between what our air is doing and how it's reaching our lips and what they are doing. And those two aspects of air and lips and our whole body, from the bottom of our lungs and our respiratory muscles and our belly and back all the way up to the tip of our lips, all of that can affect pitch. And so it's not like you're sharp. Okay, well, how do I make it, like for a lot of students, well, what do I do to make it go flatter? I don't even know that yet. And it's really hard. A lot of brass students play, and professionals play sharp all the time, and letting the pitch sink into place is a difficult thing for us. And so um, just to point out that there's not an easy answer to the intonation question, and it's not as easy as put your tuner on and the needle moves around, and then when it's there, you're in tune. It's figuring out how to create this beautiful relationship between the air that you're moving into the instrument and your lips, which are essentially resisting or shaping that airstream. And that takes experience, and that's why we practice. And interestingly enough, typically when you get that airstream marrying the lips so that they're working as a perfectly oiled system, that's both very steady but very flexible at the same time. You do that just right, you got a great sound too.
Yeah.
So, Tom, this is a really long-winded way of agreeing with you that, and with you too, Gene, that tone and pitch are married to each other, and it's a bigger picture for us than it may be for the string players. And the other thing I want to say is kind of a silly story, but I remember being coached. I think I was maybe a sophomore in college, and the coach was explaining that when you have the third of a major chord, you have to play a little bit low. And this was because our group was playing out of tune, and was like, well, and I remember thinking and not asking, that's good. How do I know if I have the third of the chord? And I mean, there's so much of just experience involved with this. Like, yeah, you got to know that you're playing the fifth of that chord or the seventh of that chord, or that we're playing the three of us are playing a chord, and it's kind of clustery, but I'm a fourth away from Tom, and so I have to lock that fourth. And well, what do I do with that fourth? Well, I make it a little tight, and it takes years of experience. And one of the ways that I learned how to play, I wouldn't go so far as to say I play in tune, but better in tune, is that in my group Meridian Arts Ensemble for years we would play Bach chorales where the beat goes like this, about, and we would make that the 16th note beat. The one, E, and two, E, and four of those makes one measure of music. And boy, you have time to work on the intonation there. And the only other thing that I will add is that, at least in a brass group, nothing kills a brass group like somebody saying, you're sharp.
Yeah.
And so you gotta do it on your own, and it's work. But it's fun because it sounds so good when it's in tune.
You remind me of a couple of things, which is one of the phrases that I use it too. We all use this phrase in brass playing. We say that we need to lip something up or down. I can lip this down. I can lip this up. And I use it too. I'm not above this, but I do think it's a dangerous way to think, because if you're sharp, there's an infinite range of lower that you can choose. If you're flat, there's an awful lot of higher that you can choose. I find that some of the best advice, in terms of intonation, if you're working with a group or when you're thinking about it in a solo context, first try sounding better. Generally speaking, try sounding better. Try to make a better sound yourself. It's always interesting to me. Oftentimes, if I'm struggling on pitch and I've got my tuner out, or I'm listening to a drone and I'm kind of struggling with it, if I can just take a step back and close my eyes, or ignore the drone for a second and make my best sound, all of a sudden that smiley face and tonal energy is lighting up, and I didn't even think about up or down. So that's a really important thing to me in terms of training your ear and thinking about that relationship.
And that smiley face in the Tonal Energy app is a brilliant piece of coding.
It is.
It is. Just makes you feel very good when you hit it. Here's another question, and I want to get the first crack at it. The question is, in what ways do you think the brass quintet repertoire bass can be improved? I think by brass quintet repertoire bass, I'm going to interpret that as just how can our repertoire get better. And so I want to say first that the brass quintet is really a new chamber music formation, as you guys know, really dating from the 1950s, from the post-World War II era, where all the brass musicians were in the army bands and orchestras, and then they were all going to Juilliard and Manhattan School of Music on the GI Bill and other conservatories. And then they were like, all right, now what do we do? And some of them went into orchestras, and some of them wanted to play chamber music, and there really wasn't brass chamber music. And from there, the repertoire grew. And now here we are 70 years later, and the repertoire's gotten big, which is great. And there's a lot of really good music out there. There's a lot of really crappy music out there. And I think the first thing to remember is, if you could transport yourself back in time to Beethoven's time, there would be a lot of really crappy music out there and a little bit of really good music out there. And so patience is called for. There's, at any time in any era, there's going to be stuff that's not as good as other stuff. And the number of genius composers and genius conductors and genius horn, trumpet, and tuba players and genius anythings is limited always. But the way the repertoire really can be bolstered, made better and better and better, is by brass groups asking people to write pieces, and then performing those pieces and recording those pieces. And the two brass groups that I've been involved with have done that, and every time a new piece is written that's good, and you were part of the commission of that piece, that smiley face lights up. And you've done a good deed for the world. And every time a not so good piece comes out of that process, that's okay too, because it takes a lot of pieces written to find a really incredible piece. We have not had a Haydn who wrote umpteen string quartets, and every one of them is amazing. But we've had lots of composers who have written lots of pieces that are very good. So I think what we do is we make ourselves available to play new music. We learn the skills to play it well. We treat every piece in concert as if it were a masterpiece. We record our pieces. We let history decide about what the good pieces are, quote unquote. Sometimes you have a piece that's thought of as not good in the 1920s suddenly becomes a great piece in 1963, and tastes change. But this is why we do what we do. Is we're always looking for wonderful pieces of music, and the more there are, the better. Tom, what do you think?
I have to say, I don't find that there's a particular deficit here. I think that we have a wide variety of really great music. Of course, some better than others, but we play all kinds of different music. And I have to say, there's a lot of good music out there. Sometimes it takes a little bit of seeking. I mean, sometimes you have to go past the obvious contenders or the kind of the standard of the brass quintet repertoire, the standards of the brass quintet repertoire, to find some of these hidden gems. But there's a lot of great stuff out there. A lot of the brass quintet tradition does depend on arranging as well. Especially thinking about early brass quintet repertoire and borrowing a lot of Renaissance music, borrowing a lot of Baroque music. This stuff is great to play too. And that process of coming up with different ways of employing brass instruments to steal repertoire from other instruments is an important thing as well. It's not quite the same as having dedicated repertoire, but I think in addition to that, in addition to asking composers, Dan, you've written some great pieces for brass quintet. I think that we should also, as brass players, write for ourselves. We need to take some responsibility for creating our repertoire beyond asking composers and, taking the initiative. If we don't write for ourselves, who's going to write for us?
Jean, you have some thoughts on this?
I have some thoughts, not specifically about brass quintet, but about contemporary music in general. Some of my favorite artists these days are ones that are just sort of defying perception as far as this fits in this box. And now that we're expressively digital, we can sort of genre mix more than ever. And so I like the idea of collaborative arts in general, involving more colors or more of the senses in a show. I'm not a huge fan of just straight up concerts where you go and sit for 2 hours, and just it's almost too much for my one, the aural sense to just consume 2 hours of music and then be done. And I personally feel like I love to have a tactile experience, or maybe a conscious experience where someone plants a question at the right time. So these like multi-sensory collaborative experiences are things that I like to go to. When I think of offering a concert, what would I like to go to as an audience member? What would make me an active listener versus being a passive listener? One example of that was Tom and Mark Hetzler wrote a piece that it was the first time in a while when it's called "Don't Look Down," and I'm sorry to pitch your show, Tom, but but it's called "Don't Look."
Right down here.
Yeah, yeah. And I just felt like such an active listener, where my mind was active, my ears were active, there was some visual stimulus that was happening, and I felt just fully satisfied with the entirety of the sensory experience. So I think that brass quintet groups can utilize that more and involve more tactility in their concerts. And, I know WBQ has asked Tony DeSanza to play percussion parts. And basically, again, it's the idea of joining two things that are seemingly unrelated. How can you do that? And how can you make something different that might bring a new audience member to you?
It's interesting that rock and roll bands figured this out a long time ago. And there's lights, there's cool gear on stage, there's smoke, sometimes there's fire, there's a very public, often backstory to the musicians themselves. There's lots to think about, and then there's great tunes,
yeah,
and show-offy technique. And I often think there's something to be learned from a great rock and roll show.
Yeah, and it works both ways too. Like, it's like, is this external sensory stimulus enhancing the piece? Or like, there have been some times when I would have loved to have a smoke machine on stage to cover up the feeling of difficulty of the moment. It's like, wouldn't that be great if you just had like an abort button that signaled a smoke machine? Yeah, but it's about the art. It's like, if these extra techniques are artfully incorporated, then it can yield a really awesome, interesting response. If it's covering something up or trying to be showy for no reason other than to just have some pizzazz, that could be dangerous.
I want to ask
Dan,
one.
I
Oh,
apologize for taking.
oh,
I was just going to say this seems like a good time to maybe talk about how we think about our own repertoire that we choose for our group and
great.
how we select repertoire. Um, and I think part of the reason why this dovetails really cleanly with what we're talking about is because we do have certain things that we want to accomplish as a group and have certain constraints in terms of the types of repertoire, how we program, why we program. So again, I'll take the position as moderator and just kind of pass that along. Dan, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, okay, I will start by saying we choose repertoire by bringing in pieces to read at the end of the spring semester. That's not going to happen this year, but we'll undoubtedly bring pieces to listen to. And they usually are pieces that come out of our experience in whatever context, another group, our own listening. This piece seems cool. This piece seems cool, but it's so hard, I don't think we can play it in a semester. Uh, this piece seems really cool, but it's really long and a challenge to listen to. It might not fit with our program. Or this piece is really nerdy, egg-headed piece. A university is the perfect place to play this piece. It wouldn't work anywhere else. And really, it's an artistic conversation among the members of the WBQ about what we're going to play, and it doesn't just stop with the actual pieces. It's like, okay, what piece? What's a good opener? What's a good closer? Jean, you got to make it through this concert. You can't play these two pieces in a row because it's just too exhausting. So what can we do to, practical considerations for
Yeah.
the pieces as well. What about a theme do we want a theme for our concert, or do we want to say I'm sick of themes? I mean, and there's no right and wrong in this, which is what's great about it. It really is this constantly stirring from moon to moon cauldron of possible ideas about how to do something, and really we should have our students in watching us do that, because I think it would be interesting. And for those who don't know, our students are invited to all our rehearsals, and many do come and observe. And the repertoire selection phase is interesting. And sometimes you'll listen to a piece and you'll hear 3 seconds and you go, "Yep, I want to play that for sure." And sometimes the opposite. Boy, you're not going to catch me dead playing this. Sorry, guys, I really don't want to play that. Gene, what about rep select?
Well, it's interesting because it's kind of like trying on an outfit, right? You have a good idea. There's this cool looking thing, a cool sounding piece, and then, but like I think the reading session, the one that I've been to, was really cool and interesting because we tried it on, and it was cool. It was fun for me to hear how this personnel plays that within a reading situation. And then somebody mentioned earlier that I really liked, like finding the hidden gems. And I think it kind of goes back to the last question, but I like the feeling of finding something and then realizing there's not very many recordings of it is very exhilarating, because you get to sort of re-bring to life these pieces. And I think the opportunity to discover rabbit holes has been really fun. And I have like, a few lists of pieces that I've really gotten into that I've been listening to from albums that have pieces on them that maybe Dan suggested. And then on that album, I'm like, oh, really, really awesome other pieces too. So it's kind of like building a repertoire base of pieces that you want to play. And then from that, speaking of like nerding out about spreadsheets, I started a spreadsheet of like repertoire I've played, repertoire I really want to play, repertoire that is like goal repertoire that I feel like I would like to revisit later. And so when the time comes to offer pieces, I can just go to that sheet and I like highlight it in yellow if it's a hidden gem. So that's my approach. What about you, Tom?
I think we face a couple of constraints that at first kind of seem at odds, but really work well. And these aren't things that typically we talk about, but I think they're things that I certainly feel, and I think you probably would both agree. One is that we are an ensemble in residence at a research institution. So part of what we need to be doing is figuring out what that next thing is, or figuring out how to keep this genre of brass quintet moving forward, how to push our audiences in such a way that we're presenting them with new things in terms of our repertoire. But then sort of on the opposite end of that, we're also an ensemble that exists within a context that is geared towards education and educating our own students. And part of that is, we want to make sure that they hear us play music that they're going to encounter in their career. We've played through all of the Ewald quintets, which are very, very standard repertoire. We played through all of them in the last 5 years or so. Those are very traditional, very standard pieces. But it's, first of all, great for us to play. I love playing those pieces, but also really great for our students who are definitely going to be in quintets that play Ewald quintets, to hear us play and rehearse those pieces. So it, to me at least, creates this sort of, I think, positive tension that we're trying to be forward-looking, and we're also trying to have this connection to the standards in the past and the tradition of the brass quintet. I feel like that works well together.
It gives us a balance.
Yeah.
It's like balancing out pieces that are challenging to listen to with pieces that are easier to listen to, especially as we travel. And the Wisconsin idea of bringing what we do out into the state is very important to us, of course, also. So, if you have a program full of gnarly contemporary music that's dissonant and a little tough to wrap your ears around, and you go out and you play that for people in concerts, and they can't stand it, you're not really doing much to bring your work to the people.
Yeah. I have a quick story. One of my first years playing in this group, I don't remember the name of the town, pretty far up there in northwest Wisconsin. And we showed up and we were playing in a gymnasium. Do you remember this, Dan?
Not yet, but I will as you keep
going. We
were
playing in a gymnasium, and we had a pretty far out program, including one piece that was, even to me, a real challenging piece, the Taxon Quintet, Ira Taxon's Brass Quintet. And I remember, taking the stage in this gymnasium going, oh boy, I don't know if this small town who invited us to come play brass quintet music in their gym, I don't know if they're going to really like what we have to offer. And I just remember we were talking to people after the performance, and person after person came up to me and said, that Taxon piece totally knocked me out. The colors, the swirling, the abstract nature of it, it was so cool. And these were people who, some of whom were very sophisticated listeners, of course, and some of whom were particularly impressed because they never would have even thought of this as being music or as being a thing that music could do. So that experience sticks with me in terms of how we program and how we bring that program to, the state, and to these different kinds of concert series that we play.
That piece, first of all, that's an amazing piece of music.
Yeah, it is.
It's just an explosion of raw energy, and let's play it next year if we're back.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
And but it is kind of a hidden gem, largely because it's hard. It's extremely hard, and also because I think there's a fear of upsetting audiences. But as you point out, no, I mean, I've performed that piece over 100 times, and that piece engages people, even if they were to say they don't like modern music, because the energy level is just, you can't resist it. It's so powerful.
And the other thing I would say about that in terms of connecting to audiences, and specifically connecting to audiences during that performance, a huge part of that is how do you present the piece and how do you introduce the piece? And how can you create those connections or open up those connections so that when they're experiencing these things that they've never thought about in terms of music, musical experiences, how do they process those things in the moment when they're hearing those colors or those combinations of sounds for the first time as a new experience?
Yeah, I just want to add to that because it reminded me of a question that was asked earlier, which is, what should music majors be doing more? And one thing I think I've been reflecting upon myself with is I always plan my speaking last. for a piece. And actually, whenever I have a concert, often the comments afterwards are like, I love what you said about blah blah blah. Or when the horn player told a story about the David Sampson, oftentimes what they are remembering and holding on to is what's said about the piece and like the entry point that's offered into the piece. And you can offer a really crazy wild piece, but if you build a bridge for the audience, it becomes possible. But you have to be, I think it's a really great skill to develop, because I've seen people do it really, really quite beautifully. But you also don't want to project for your audience. It's like assuming that a rural community might not like this more contemporary piece. Well, that's actually often not true. And there's like these assumptions that we have, oh, it's this kind of community, they're going to want this. And, there are stereotypes that I feel like if they specifically ask for a patriotic piece, you probably should bring some patriotic music. But I do find that like allowing an entry point that doesn't in any way dumb it down and also sticks to the very authentic artist inside of you as a performer, you're way more likely to hit a bullseye with your audience than you are with like trying to artificially make something for them that's not also connected to you.
I want to ask one final question from our students, but it's a big one. I suspect it's going to be a whole conversation. And the two of you can decide who wants to go first. It's a two-part question and big. So sit back. When are you at your most creative? How do you approach creative work?
You got it, Gene.
Okay, I don't feel like my answer to this is really particularly huge. I am at my most creative when I'm running. And so I have a list in my phone of things it's ironically called my BS list, but my brainstorm list, but it's also, there ends up being a lot of BS that I think about. But, from piles and piles of crap comes creativity and comes creative work. And so I have to schedule time in to run as a mandatory, reflective, creative project for myself. And then in the mornings, I have a focused mind, usually a lot more so than in the evenings. I can get really spacey and loopy in the evenings, depending on how much sleep I've had. So I really enjoy that time to be sort of absorbing things, reflecting upon and absorbing things from the day, or thinking about things I want my students to try. But the mornings is really when I can write, or I can philosophize about a video album or something like that. And then another thing, it's not really a when answer, but it's more about some points that both Dan and Tom have touched on tonight that resonated with me. And it's about the creative process in general, or creating. And it's like Dan said, you start writing music by writing music and putting a double bar line whenever you're done. And then, we also say, well, there's good music and bad music out there. Don't be afraid to be the person who puts out bad music. I think there's this like hierarchy sometimes in our culture that's like, this person's good, this person's bad. What do I need to do as a student to get good enough? I'm sorry, but it is a huge spectrum, and there is no answer to that. And also there's no answer to what validation does good work get? It's sometimes crap work can get a lot of publicity, and sometimes really amazing work can be heard by very few. And so I think if I could do something over again, I would not be so scared to put out work that I was worried that would suck in other people's minds. And just produce, and let some of your productions be bad, and let some of your productions be getting better, and let some of them be great. And you'll find your needle in the haystack, but you can only do that after, producing quite a bit. And then there's this, it actually is a little unrelated, but I hope that we can, touch back down to the subject. But I did want to share a little something about something that Dan had mentioned earlier about uh, why, like he was talking about more about like becoming a music major or deciding to study music. And first of all, if you have the creative juices and you have that excitement that comes from it, it's a great path for anybody who might be a prospective student out there. Something I decided when I was 18 was I come from a family that is all in the medical field, in the education field, and I decided I was really scared to be a music major, but I decided honestly, if I'm 85 years old, will I have regretted dedicating at least a decade of my life to producing an art? And I knew the answer would always be no. I will not regret spending a solid amount of time really plugging into whatever this beautiful art form is. And I gave myself 10 years to explore, and then I could pivot if after that. And in those 10 years, I feel like I sort of explored what it meant to be expressive and to take other people's music, and what it meant to be creative and to create my own stuff. And so I find also that my most creative moments in that time have been when I had a little time, which touches greatly into what we're in now. Like, I had a little space to reflect and to let maybe dust that had been pressed down from all of my other conscious bombardments from this busy life, when that dust was allowed to reappear in my brain, I feel like those are the moments of strongest creativity. And I've really enjoyed kind of like dusting again and letting that all come out. So this moment right now, I feel like is a creative burst for myself, although I have to produce it first. So let me get back on that later. What about you, Tom?
For me, I kind of distinguish between creativity and production or productivity. So for me, the creativity comes from stillness and from making time to do nothing with no pressure. And along with that, I'm at my most creative when I'm doing a lot of really broad listening to things that are just compelling to me, interesting to me, and listening to many different kinds of things. And then when I'm listening, I'm not doing other things. I'm listening deeply and intensely. um, I find a lot of creativity from just thinking, I play tuba. So a lot of what I think about when I listen to music that I like is, I wonder if there's a way that I could do this on my instrument. That process of leaving space and not having the pressure to create, but just experiencing and thinking about music is a really important thing in terms of creativity. And then, I mean, the results of that are the most important results, but then you actually have to create it. And that, to me, getting into that sort of production mindset, it's all about scheduling time and just forcing myself to sit down and go. And sometimes that can be really tedious, and sometimes it can be really frustrating. But on a daily basis, just saying, I'm going to spend a little bit of time. It could be 5 minutes, it could be an hour. A little bit of time taking this concept that I've gotten from this, less active, stiller time in my life, and actually making it come to life. So that would be my answer. How about you, Dan?
I feel like I've been creative in different ways, and it's different every time. The drill book that I just wrote felt like it wasn't a major work of creativity, but it felt like it was a sort of like a teaching creativity. And I probably wrote the drills in 2 hours. I mean, it took longer to, make a real book out of them, but it came fast. I'm also working on a piece for horn and fixed media, and that one's slow. That's a big 45-minute long piece, and that's slow. But in every case, I think where I'm writing an actual piece of music, I what I write comes out of picking up my horn and playing and coming up with something that feels good and right to play. And then I sort of get when novelists say the characters tell me what they're going to do and what they're going to say, because once you write a couple of notes, then there's the next note has to be a certain way, and it's hard to say why. And I think you have to trust that. And Gene, like you were saying, you have to be willing for it to be bad. Like, you write something and maybe it's terrible. You can be like Brahms and burn it if it's no good. Fine. Or in the case of our modern world, you just delete the file and boom, it's gone. But you have to have the courage to say, I think what needs to happen next is an E flat dotted quarter note. And so you write it, and then you see what happens, and then you go, nope, that was a wrong turn. Go back and try something else. And it's hard to say what the right mood is to generate this. It's more like you get into the project. You know, like you, Gene, you go for a run, and you want to run, so you run, and you get into that, and that frees your mind. I don't. It's hard for me to complete a project unless I get into it. Sometimes a deadline can help. Sometimes you get inspiration from whatever. I mean, I wrote you a piece, and some of the main stuff that came from the piece was just from my playing stuff on the horn. But I also, you sound so great, and I knew what was going to come out, and that was an inspiration to keep going. In the end, you make the piece sound way better than it actually is, for which I'm grateful. But you know, there is a payoff when you're creative in creating something that then people play and they make it seem great, and hopefully the stuff doesn't just exist in a computer file or on a piece of staff paper, but becomes made into a real thing. And what's really fun is, like, my brass quintet, which is called Zen Monkey. I've performed that piece just many, 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 many times, and including with WBQ. And I love it when somebody has an idea. What if we did so and so? They have an interpretive idea that I never thought of, even though I wrote the piece. And it's like, whoa, that yes, let's do it that way. I wish I'd thought of that. That's just so satisfying. And then I've written a bunch of etude books, which is a whole different kind of a thing. But you think, okay, what's hard? What's hard? And no one's made it. No one's written stuff for people to have to do it a lot. And then, you know, if you know your instrument well enough, that's easy. It's like, well, I know I struggle with this. And I feel like I struggle with everything. So anything I write can be an etude.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, this is hard. So let's do it a whole bunch of different ways in a row. So yeah, creativity is not a single thing. But I know that Brahms used to walk in the woods to get his musical ideas. So, Gene, I think you and Brahms are on the same page.
Do not compare the two.
I also think that one thing that's underrated in terms of creativity is constraints. Whether that's
Yes.
a concept or a scale or an instrument or a form, coming up with things to constrain creativity can sometimes be just an automatic path. I mean, one obvious example is serialism. You lay out the concept, you come up with the material, and the piece writes itself. And that's obviously an extreme version of constraints, but just any sort of process that helps focus you from it could be anything to it's something is an important part of creativity for me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just, going to add that I think the people that I think are the most creative have sort of somewhat equal parts intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, where you're excited to make something and create it, but there's also a fire under you. It's got to happen. There's a deadline or whatever. And speaking outside of the realm of creating, as far as writing music, if you have a creative concert idea or collaborative concert, all you need is you need ingredients, but all you really need to start the process is the idea, a feasible working plan, and a venue and a date. And once you put that down, that extrinsic motivation that we are trained to abide by from day one of public school or private school or whatever will kick in, and you've got to deliver on the date that you're delivering. And I find that as a great means to being forced to produce.
Tom, I want to come back to what you were saying about serial music. And first, I want to explain for people who don't know that serial music is a kind of atonal music in which there's atonal, meaning there's not a home key, there's not a note that you recognize as the resting place. But beyond that, there's a democracy of pitches where there are 12 notes on the black and white keys, and none of them matters more than any other. It's merely the sequence of these 12 pitches and playing with that sequence, turning it upside down or backwards or breaking it into pieces, that makes up the compositional tools. And this is a kind of music that was being developed in the teens, the 1910s, and has met with a lot of success at the level of professional composers, and mostly failure at the level of audiences who find it opaque, very hard to penetrate and listen to. But what is fascinating is that Igor Stravinsky, who wrote The Rite of Spring, went through a phase of writing serial music. And sure enough, what it sounds like is Stravinsky. It didn't matter that he changed the composition language. Still, his voice was so powerful. And there is this thing, voice. So you put on the radio and it's a Wagner opera, and you've never heard this one, but it has to be a Wagner opera. It sounds like Wagner. And that's so cool. Or a Brahms string quartet. You didn't know it, but no one else could have written that. And this idea of a musical voice is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's exciting and being creative to try to figure out what is the voice of this project, what is this project trying to do, and then you just plunge, you dive into it all the way, and you say whatever happens, that's what this thing has to be. Hope people like it, because it is what it is.
Yep.
So thank you guys. This is great having a conversation about stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe we can do it again.
Yeah. I hope people find it useful, but if not, I sure had a good time just chatting.
Me too.
Yeah.
I think we'll do it again.
Yeah.
Okay. Good night.
Awesome. All right.
All
Good
right. Have a good
night.
night.